Hey everyone, welcome to Reddit Readout. Today we are checking out ProRevenge. Story 1. An attorney's dream case. My parents vs the bank. In 1973, my parents had enough money to build a little ranch house in the country. The small bank in town approved the mortgage and the bank signed a contract to give Bob the money to build the house. Bob, as it turns out, was overbooking himself all over town, leaving his clueless minions to do the actual work. The build took longer and longer, with more and more work having to be ripped out and redone. We're not talking about using the wrong color paint or nailing up some wonky trim, here. The architect forgot to fully erase a line on the blueprints and the framers built a wall through the bathtub. My mother was told don't put anything heavy in the kitchen cabinets BC they were attached to the drywall, not the studs, using a few roofing nails through the back of each cabinet. The garage door opening was framed into the living room instead of towards the driveway. And so on. When the bank's representative showed up for the final inspection, my parents met him in the front yard and refused to sign off on Bob's work. Then representative became angry, as the bank had paid Bob a lot of money. He strode to the front door and pulled on the doorknob, whereupon the entire door casing included fell on him. It had simply been wedged, not nailed, into place. The bank called Bob, who finally showed up to supervise the work himself. The only problem was that Bob wasn't any better at building a house than his minions were. My parents still refused to sign off on the house. My mother was a Sam in a nasty rental with 2 tiny children while my dad was working 2 jobs while this was going on. Throughout the entire process, the bank and Bob treated them very poorly, bullying my mom and lying to my dad. What should have been an exciting time for my parents was ruined. My mom cried a lot. My dad got depressed. Finally, the bank threatened my parents with foreclosure and Bob threatened to sue my parents for breach of contract BC. The bank refused to pay him any more money. So my exhausted parents went to an attorney and gave him the rundown. Plumbing, electrical, tiling issues, the whole sorry mess. My parents were scared. All they had was their small down payment savings, so if this became a lengthy court battle the bank and Bob would win. The attorney, Tom, was kind, but my dad said he could tell that he and Mom were doomed from Tom's facial expressions as he sorted through the paperwork. Then, abruptly, Tom smiled. "Let's get everyone together for a meeting," he told my parents. "Tomorrow." So my parents, Tom, the bank's representative, the bank's attorney, Bob, and Bob's attorney met at the bank. Tom didn't give anyone else time to begin. He said, "Well, my clients have decided that they no longer want this house. Please remove it." Everyone else start to laugh. "Remove it? Have you lost your mind?" Tom, in a sweeping, theatrical gesture, placed a deed on the table. "My clients own the land the house is sitting on outright. They no longer want the house. Get the house off my client's land." Bob's attorney stared at the deed, and then turned and stared at Bob. "You built a house on land you don't own?" Bob nodded. The bank's attorney started yelling at the bank's representative. "You didn't finance the land the house is on?" The representative stammered, "No." Tom said firmly, "As I said, gentlemen, you're trespassing on my client's land. I expect the house to be removed and the land returned to its original state, at once." My dad said he'll remember the blank looks everyone on the other side of the table passed to one another for his whole life. Sure, the bank could foreclose on a house that wouldn't exist by the end of the week, with no way to recoup the money. They didn't even own the land it was on. Bob was out the 50% he'd paid out of pocket, plus he was on the hook for tearing down the house and removing it. On top of that, the bank would undoubtedly want him to repay the initial 50% they'd given him. Could they have gone after my parents? Sure. A foreclosure would have meant bad credit for my parents moving forward. They might lose their down payment. But to sign off on the house in its condition at that time would have meant thousands and thousands of dollars in cash to replace/repair everything from the roof to the basement before the house could be safely lived in. The bank knew my parents didn't have that kind of money, they're the ones who approved the mortgage. Suddenly, my parents were good people, it was all such a misunderstanding, and the bank and Bob couldn't do enough for them. The house was brought in line with the original blueprints and specifications immediately, at no extra cost to my parents, but at considerable cost to Bob. My parents signed the mortgage. Bob got the rest of his money, and just about broke even on the build. The bank's representative was fired. And Tom, attorney extraordinaire, got a stinging tale of triumph to recall to fellow attorneys for the rest of his life. Asterisk before you question this tale, please remember that 1973 was 50 years ago. Banks did things differently back then. Smaller rural banks, in particular, were not run the same way the bigger, city banks were. There were far fewer federal regulations, and in a smaller community people didn't always follow them, anyway. I'm pretty sure they don't always follow them now. Asterisk yes, they built a wall through the bathtub. No, I'm not making that up. I even left out how a plumber left his lunch bag on a partially built kitchen cabinet, but the cabinet maker didn't feel it was his job to move the bag, so he left it there and built the rest of the cabinet around it. I don't know where Bob found these people, but they were gems, every one of them. /S. Story 2. Malicious Compliance vs. ProRevenge. Disclaimer to begin, writing this on mobile while half watching a toddler in a kiddie pool, forgive me and my foul mouth. And like any good story, we need a bit of backstory to set the stage. High school sucked because I was a forever friend-zoned nerdy gamer guy, so I decided for my senior year I was going to get out of Ohio and study abroad. I slept through 3 years of German, so I applied to go to Germany. Ended up getting placed in Salzburg, Austria, which is the most beautiful place on earth I've been to date and need to visit again soon. The study abroad place had a few warnings for the next year before I left: don't get in criminal trouble, don't get shit grades, and don't fall in love. My only danger with the first one was my lead foot. I totaled my first car but was allowed to drive my old man's 95 Ranger 4-cylinder 5-speed, and it barely got out of its own way. The second one, I did enough to get C's and B's without caring much. The third one, through some teenage angsty drama that is a story for another time, I end up meeting, dating and falling madly in love with my now wife and mother of my daughter. I am 17, work full-time for summer. As stated, my old man lets me borrow his truck after I get off work. The rules are I have to be home by 10 weekdays and 11 on weekends. He justifies this that if I broke down or whatever, he'd have to come get me and fix the truck before he had to leave for work at 6. To my turbocharged hormones, this is tyranny. I spend every moment I'm not at work with my GF because boobs and making out are awesome. But summer is quickly coming to an end and I have to leave the country. The last day before I have to leave, my old man eases the restriction and says I can have until midnight to be home and can be gone all day. We leave for NYC the next morning at 10. This is when I hatch a plan. I'm leaving the country so I can't be given a worse curfew or extra chores, and my family wouldn't piss away the study abroad money unless it was dire. I spend the whole day with my GF and tell her to wait up after I leave. I have a surprise. I drive home and make it there at 11:58, creep into my room and spend the next hour aiming her. At 1 I roll the truck down the driveway and head back to her house, fall asleep with her in my arms. Life is perfect. I knew full good and goddamn well I was breaking the intent but not the letter of the law. My argument was that my old man never said how early I could go to her house. I never woke up before noon, so it was just left unsaid. Perfect malicious compliance in my head. I wake up at 9, just enough time for a teary goodbye and to haul ass home to head to NYC to fly to Vienna. But I look out the door and the truck is gone. I panic and realize I'm a dead man. My trip is off. I'm gonna have to work all the hours to pay my old man back for a stolen truck and wasted trip. I'm never going to have time to see my GF and I'll never experience Europe like I wanted. I call my old man in this panic to hear him answer with deafening silence upon hearing the news. Now for my old man's pro-revenge. He heard me roll in just before midnight and went fully to sleep. He did not hear me roll out at one because years of playing Dungeons and Dragons taught me how to be a good sneaky archer type. But when he woke up at 6 and saw both the truck and I were gone, he knew there was only one place in the world I could possibly be. So he and my stepmom drove over to my GF's and with the spare key took the truck and went home. When he got my call a few hours later, he gave a full 30-second beat and then began yelling and told me I better find his damn truck or I was never gonna see the outside of my room again, much less my GF or Austria. I'm freaking out, running around her neighborhood asking if anyone had seen the truck, about to call the cops when he calls back 5 minutes later laughing his ass off. He tells me he stole the truck and I was in deep shit and I better be home fast. He makes me get a ride home with my GF and her mom. When I arrive, he is standing in the driveway smug as hell. I get berated for an entire 6-hour drive to NYC about how big of a dumbass I am and leave the country as planned. It all works out in the end. I got the girl who I am happily with 17 years later and the truck until she died of Ohio rust 12 years later. TLDR, I maliciously comply with curfew only to leave an hour later. Old man extracts ProRevenge by stealing the truck and making me panic. Story 3. Intentionally unintentional revenge on a mailbox vandal. This is my dad's revenge, not mine, and this happened last summer. My parents live out on a lake just outside of town. Their property extends to both sides of the road, and their mailbox is on the opposite side of the lake and the house. Over the 4 years they had lived at the property, a black SUV has knocked down their mailbox 6 times. They catch the vehicle on the security camera on the gate but get no identifying info. My dad would report it every time, but not much could be done. It was knocked over by a drunk driver once as well, but he crashed a bit further down the road, so that was the only time that my dad got reimbursed for the damage. Well, after the 7th time it was knocked down, he had had enough. The land on the opposite side of the road dropped off steeply immediately after the shoulder, so my dad contracted some guys to build out a small gravel pad, 15 feet long and 3 feet deep or so he could set his mailbox back from the road. My dad told me that if someone tried to knock it down now, they would regret it. Well, about 4 months after the work was complete, my parents were awoken to a loud crash in the middle of the night. They called the police and went out to investigate. They found the black SUV off the road and having crashed into a very large tree. The guy was taken to the hospital and was charged with a DUI from the crash as well as possession of drugs they found in the vehicle. By building out the gravel pad and moving the mailbox back by just a few feet, it still appeared that the mailbox was on the shoulder, and still seemed like an easy target. In reality, those 3 feet made all the difference. Because the pad was so short, the vandal left the roadway before the pad started, and when the right side of his vehicle went off the shoulder, his car went veering down the steep incline. The dude was pretty badly injured, and I know my dad felt bad about this. I think this was much more effective than he had in his mind. My dad isn't the kind of person to intentionally injure someone, so I am sure he was hoping to just cause damage to a vehicle and teach a lesson that way. That's all for today. Please don't forget to like and subscribe.